welcome for the first of several events over the next 2 days that's honoring the farm workers movement, especially in Arizona. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome so many veterans, first of all, who are here with us. And they will be here with us, and we invite your participation. This particular event is focused on Miriam Powell's fantastic The Crusades of Cesar Chavez, a biography of Cesar Chavez. I am Matt Garcia. I am the director of the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and I'm also an author who's written about it. So I envision this as beginning as a conversation about the challenges of writing about the movement and about a man who is known to all of us, which is Cesar Chavez. And fortunately, we're anchoring this conversation with the most impressive book ever written about the movement, and that's The Crusades of Cesar Chavez by Miriam Powell. Many of you know who Miriam is, but for those that don't, I'm going to introduce her now. Miriam is an author, journalist, and independent scholar who spent most of the last decade writing about California farm workers, agriculture, Cesar Chavez, and the United Farm Workers Union. Her latest book, The Crusades of Cesar Chavez, has been hailed in starred reviews as the first and definitive biography of this iconic leader. Her work has been supported or was supported by a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The biography picks up where her first book left off, and I brought the books for, here you go. The Union of Their Dreams, right? This book is the story of the heady and life-changing days of the farm worker movement, told through the eyes of 8 key participants. The Crusades of Cesar Chavez, let's put this up here, is a biography and a study of the man like no other. It explores Chavez's beginnings as the son of a dispossessed farm owner who is forced into the migrant stream in farm worker activism in 1939. It covers his discovery and training as an organizer by his lifelong mentor, Fred Ross, of the Community Service Organization. And it covers the creation, success, and demise of the most successful farm worker union he founded. I should say co-founded, right, Gil Padilla? The United Farm Workers. This is truly a breathtaking book that will shape our knowledge about farm worker activism and the pursuit of farm worker justice for years to come. Miriam's worked for 25 years as a reporter and editor. She has spent those 25 years as award-winning reporter and editor, I'm repeating myself, in her native New York. She helmed the Newsday coverage of the 1996 crash of TWA Flight 800 that won the Pulitzer Prize. And in her adopted LA hometown, she was a writer for the Los Angeles Times, and she won another Pulitzer Prize for her reporting in 2003 on wildfires. At the Times, she also was the author of a 4-part series on the United Farm Workers, UFW, A Broken Contract, which appeared in January 8th, 2006, for which she received a 103-page official rebuttal from the UFW and lots of hell. So I thought it was incredibly brave, the first book, and then she doubled down and went at this one in very impressive fashion. Her work is part of a renaissance of farm worker history that has happened over the last 5 years. 4 recent books have looked back at the early decades of the UFW from different perspectives. Sometimes David Wins in 2009 by Marshall Gans, who's a veteran of the movement and a lead organizer. Trampling Out the Vintage in 2011 by Frank Bardicke, who worked in the fields. And From the Jaws of Victory, my own book, in 2012. And we're graced with the presence of Humberto Garza, who wrote about the CSO and the making of the UFW, organizing the Chicano movement, the story of CSO. And Humberto taught me a lot about CSO and helped me to write my book, so I thank you, Humberto. But today, we are here to honor Miriam and start the conversation. And so let's begin. Welcome, Miriam.
Thanks, Matt. And I don't think we should honor me, really, at all. I think that all I did was a lot of work that needed to be done and that hopefully will help to tell the stories that need to be told and that haven't been told before. So I was thinking back on the way here of the first time I met you and the first time Matt and I appeared together when neither of our books were even near completion, I think, right, at Wayne State. And we both spent a lot of time in the archives in Detroit, where the UFW has all of its resources, and we can talk a little bit later about what some of those are, because I think it's an important part of the story that so much material was preserved, both documents and audio tapes, and both of us have relied heavily on that in our research. And I guess the reason I wrote this, when I wrote The Union of Their Dreams, I thought I was done writing about the farm worker movement, and I did not intend to write another book. And a lot of people started to say to me, you should write a biography of Cesar. And I said, nah, I wrote my book, I'm done. But ultimately, I became convinced that it was an important book to write and that I was in a good position to write it because of all the work that I had done prior to that time. And the fact that there had not been a book written, we can talk more about why that was, because Cesar Chavez died 21 years ago this month and left this enormous resource, and lots of people knew that there was a resource that was there, and people didn't know the extent of it and didn't know what was in it, but everyone knew that there was material there. And for many years, the historians who were in a position to write about Cesar Chavez chose not to. And I want to give Matt a lot of credit here, because I think that his book, as he said, is part of a renaissance in the work that's been done about the farm worker movement and Cesar Chavez. And it took a lot more courage on your part to take that on than it did for me. No, I mean that. There are an awful lot of historians, and particularly Chicano historians, who did not want to tackle this subject at all because they felt that it would be tarnishing a legacy, and they didn't want to be in that position. And I think that one of the things that Matt and I share in common is a vision that writing the truth about this and writing about what actually happened and writing about Cesar Chavez in all of his complexity does not take away from the legacy. It does not tarnish his heroic accomplishments. And what he did and what he achieved and the reason that things are named after him, and all those are really important parts of the story. But he is not a saint. He is not a cartoon character, as has been portrayed recently in the film and in other earlier work. He's a really complicated, flawed person, just like anyone else. So I think that we need to redefine our concept of heroes to some degree. And heroes have flaws too. And if anybody has studied Greek mythology at all, or just read basic 8th grade Greek mythology, you may recall that the Greek heroes were they were half mortal and half divine. They were the offspring of a god and a mortal. And so from their god parent, their divine parent, they inherit these superhuman powers that enable them to overcome incredible obstacles and achieve these sort of remarkable feats that make them heroes. But they also always have, like Achilles' heel, which is the example that we always remember, they always have mortal flaws. And ultimately, what makes them interesting and the reason that we remember them so well and that their stories have survived is their mortality and their complex personalities and character. So I don't think that Cesar Chavez has been done a great service by all of the decades of portraying him as a just perfect person, or as his descendants like to say, he was just an ordinary man who did extraordinary things. It's really not true. He really was fairly extraordinary, but he also had a lot of complicated things about his personality, and there were parts of, he had successes and he had failures, and those need to be studied and discussed and debated, and the decisions that he made, and we can talk about some of the decisions that he made that affected Arizona in particular, where there was a lot of impact and not all of it positive by any means. So that's why I wrote the book, and I hope that it's part of a larger discussion that Matt, again, has, I think, been a big part of initiating and supporting.
Thank you, Miriam. I mean, for a while here, and I thought that this would be a conversation about writing history, so this is a good place to start. You know, when I published my book, I felt I caught a lot of hell as well, but it was nothing like the hell that you caught after 2006, so we kind of passed it back and forth. But I would say that the hell that both you and I caught was nothing compared to the people that suffered in silence, who chose to articulate their own vision or an alternative vision for the movement that were purged from the Union. And so, I mean, in some ways, I think about them as well when I think about the work that we've done and the struggles that we've had. And so in many ways, I feel like your book is a vindication, not just for the things that I uncovered, that we've uncovered, that we've actually restored and preserved, but also the work that many, many people in the movement engaged in and were not honored for. And so this is a special time in terms of remembering their work.
I think it's also a way of opening up a conversation. I mean, and some of what we're talking about may not be clear to everyone, so let me just back up a little bit. There were a lot of things that were unpleasant that happened in the Farm Workers Union. There were a lot of people who were thrown out. There were a lot of fights over the direction of the movement. And ultimately, and this is what I caught flack for, was writing about the UFW today and saying that it was not a force in the fields, and that in essence, that the UFW had failed as a labor union, and talking about the impact that had on farm workers today, which is to say that there is no union fighting for them in the fields. And that then got me back into the history, because I found I didn't think I was going to write. Most journalists don't write about history. Journalists write about what's happening today, and that's what I was doing. But I went to talk to people, some of them in this room, who had lived through that history, just to kind of, I thought, understand how to put the present into context, and how to understand, you know, how did this iconic institution, which many people in this country still today believe that the UFW represents lots and lots of farm workers and conditions are all better in the fields because of the UFW. And when I realized that that was not true, and that was the part that Matt referred to that got them upset with me, I wanted to understand how that came to pass. So how did we get from a time when the UFW really did achieve some remarkable victories against great odds to today, where it is not a force at all in the fields? And that's how I started to get into the history, and then found that there were events that happened in the late 1970s and the early 1980s that really were so key in shaping the direction of the Union, that ultimately we did an unusual thing as a newspaper and wrote an entire part of the series about those events. And so then I got further and further into the history, and that's what started it. But what got me to that point, Matt, was to say that I think that all of the work that's being done now in this book and your book as well have kind of opened up a conversation for people who in many ways never talked about these things, because part of the sort of ethos of the left especially is that you don't air your dirty linen in public, and you don't talk about bad things that happen because for fear of hurting the cause. So there are people today who I think in some ways it's a relief for them to come to terms with what happened and to be able to have that conversation. And there are a few exceptions, a few notable exceptions, one of whom is with us today, of someone who did speak out at the time, but he was very much the exception.
We're going to take questions from the audience, but I wanted to kick it off by focusing on the book a little bit and some of the ways in which you wrote it. And one of the things that is noteworthy, Miriam, from my perspective, who uses oral history and then uses the quotes, and I quote, for example, Gilbert Padilla, and have him reflecting on the past in the present, or at least the present that I'm writing the book. You consciously didn't do that except for Gus Gutierrez at the very end, which sums up the book. But with that notable exception, the book is really archivally driven. It's taken from the archives. It's actually what's being said at the time or being written at the time. Can you talk about the decision that you made not to draw on quotes for the most part?
I thought that it was a way to, I did it for a couple of reasons, I would say. One is that people's memories are, they're their memories, and memories conflict, and the further away you are from time, the less reliable memories are. So I knew that much of this would be controversial as well, or would, potentially be challenged. And I thought that the more that it could be drawn from things that were said at the time, and again, there are these great resources, the tapes, and there are also letters and their journals and their diaries, and there are all sorts of things like that. So I thought that the more I could use that material and build that as a foundation, the more accurate and the more defensible it would be. But as a writer, and I know you want to talk about the writing aspect of it, as a writer, I wanted the reader to stay in the narrative, to stay in the time. So if you're quoting somebody in the present, you're kind of taking them out of that time period. And the trade-off is that you get someone reflecting from the present on what happened. But I wanted it to try to sort of just proceed chronologically and keep the reader in time.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I think in some ways it's a validation of some of the things that I'm talking about that I got challenged for, because some people said, well, it's conjecture, or that's Gilbert Padilla's viewpoint, or Jerry Cohen's viewpoint, or Marshall Gann's. But the fact that you did have it so archivally based, I think really helped nail the history.
Right, exactly.
And I was pleased with that.
And it also, there were things that there were sort of certain key decisions that were made sometimes that people just didn't remember. I mean, I would ask, why did the union decide to do X? And everyone was like, I don't know, I don't remember, I wasn't there, suddenly we were doing it, and then you just, so I knew that I had to try to really figure that out, and it just becomes like a big puzzle. And then when you actually find the discussion where people are talking about it, it sort of, brings it all together.
Let me ask about, there's so many great insights in this book, and it really rewrites the history, even some of what I found. So one of the issues is La Paz, okay? La Paz is in the news because President Obama made it a figure to look at and to visit during his re-election campaign. It's now undergoing a process of becoming a national park. But if you actually talk to people in the movement, there are some that would say that that's where the movement went to die. That there were a lot of problems at La Paz. And what's interesting about your book is that it pushes it back to the dichotomy between the Pink House and where it started, and even 40 Acres, which is seen as kind of hallowed ground. So can you talk about the ways in which the origins of the movement, 40 Acres and La Paz figures in geographically in the book?
Sure. I mean, I think that place was really important to Cesar Chavez. One can conjecture that some of this has to do with losing the family farm when he was a kid and being displaced and becoming a migrant worker. But having a community was always something that he talked about and sort of schemed about and was visionary about in some ways. So that the movement starts in Delano, which is in Central California. It was the heart of the table grape industry. And he goes there in 1962, and he moves there because he has family there, and his wife has family there, and because there is access to this broad range of thousands of workers within the San Joaquin Valley. And the first headquarters is just the cheapest place that they can find. It was an old Pentecostal church on the edge of the fields, and his brother turns it into the headquarters. But as soon as the strike starts in 1965, and by 1967, despite the fact that they're in the middle of this, very tough fight against agribusiness, and they're 2 years into the strike, and things are not going all that well, and yet he commissions one of his top people to find a place that could be a headquarters for the union and an educational center. And they end up buying a land which is called 40 Acres. It is now a National Historic something also on the National Historic Register, I guess. And it was literally 40 acres. It was just just barren land across from the dump. And there's a wonderful tape recording of Chavez talking to Leroy Chatfield, one of his top aides, and a couple of other people about his sort of vision for 40 acres and talking about wanting to turn it into a farm workers' cathedral and having fountains and swimming pools and all sorts of things like that. And so he had this kind of vision of wanting to have a place and a community that would be a center. I think the discrepancy between 40 acres, which was envisioned as a center for farm workers, and then La Paz, which is in the foothills of the Tehachapi Mountains. It's not near any agricultural land, not that close to the fields. It was an abandoned tuberculosis sanatorium that was owned by the county of Kern and purchased by the UFW in 1971. So there's about a 5-year difference between 40 acres and La Paz. And by 1971, he wants to be away from the fields. He feels like he needs to be removed from where the action is, and the union now has like hundreds of contracts. They've won the strike. So there actually are lots of farm workers making demands, and there's a hiring poll, and there's a medical plan, and there's all this stuff going on there. And that's the point of time in which he says, we need to have an educational center somewhere else because there's too much going on here. So that decision to remove himself from the fields, and there then become security issues, and there are lots of ways in which that is justified, but ultimately it becomes, I mean, even at the time, certainly people questioned, why are we moving away from where the farm workers are? And he clearly wanted to do that. And then when he talks about the plans for La Paz later on and building a community there, and ultimately there are hundreds of people who live there, and the plans for La Paz are never about farm workers anymore. It's not a farm workers' cathedral. It's a community and a cooperative place where people who work for the union can live, and where he can try to build some sort of a community that will give people something in return for working essentially for free.
Yeah. And one of the great insights of your book is also a reinterpretation of the fast and the ways in which the fast was not necessarily the strategy that everybody accepted as the best strategy, that it led to some problems. And I wanted you to just talk about the strategy of the fast, how it worked and how it didn't work.
I mean, I think the fast was an enormous success,
Yeah.
essentially. It was a huge strategic success, and it was a big turning point for the union and for Cesar to some degree. I quote Jim Drake, who was a Protestant minister and a really significant player in the early years of the union, and he said in an interview shortly after the fast that after the fast, Cesar was too saintly to make mistakes. So I think the degree to which the fast, and like probably everyone has seen the image of Bobby Kennedy breaking the fast with Cesar, that's probably the most sort of still iconic image of the movement. That just catapulted him into a sort of level of national fame. Also really cemented the suffering image and the idea of penance and the importance of that. And it was enormously effective as an organizing strategy. The religious aspects of the fast, the nightly masses, people walking on their knees up the path to 48, the fast was at 40 acres. So I think for all those reasons, it was extremely effective as a technique. It exacerbated some existing tensions, and I think to understand them, we have to back up a little bit from when the strike first starts. He says we have to find a cross between being a movement and a union. He says that the first week of the strike in 1965. So he's very aware, much more so than most of the other people around him, that there is he sees this tension between the movement and the union. And for a long time, they're able to coexist and that tension doesn't come out. But the fast is one of the points in time where particularly some of the Filipino leaders and some of the people who object to the religious imagery find the fast really upsetting and see it as something that is about being, saintly as opposed to being a labor leader.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to also ask about the issue of purges, which is another difficult topic. We'll talk about the movie tomorrow, but the movie steers clear of the 1970s, which some people have said, well, that's why the purges were not there, because the film doesn't go into the 70s. And I think what's amazing about your book was that the purges began in 1967. Right. There's a portion of the book. In June 1967, Chavez initiated the first purges. A half dozen individuals were targeted for different reasons, but the common denominator was the accusation that they had become disloyal, created dissension, and undermined the leadership. The cover story became ties to the Communist Party and leftist groups, a plausible justification given the relatively recent high-profile purges within the labor movement. Chavez had been red-baited from the start, and the McCarthy era was still recent history. Any taint of communist influence could hurt the Union. How much of this was anti-communism, and how much of it was other forces or other issues that shaped Chavez's penchant for purging over this period of time?
So I don't think any of it was anti-communist. I don't think that, I think the anti-communist cover was a lot more plausible in 1967 than it was in 1977, and because of the proximity to the Cold War. But I agree. I think the 1967 purges are very significant because they so presage what happened later. And you see and there are notes, again, this is why the archival material was so important, and because I talked to lots of different people who had been involved in this, and everybody sort of had their little piece of the story, and then you find the actual notes and the minutes from the meetings where they discussed this and where the votes were taken, and those just become, indisputable. So, in the later, there were a lot of people, there are people today who were in the movement who were purged or were voluntarily left because they were upset with the direction of the movement in the 70s, who would say, everything was great in the beginning and it was a democracy and everything was wonderful, and then something happened and Cesar changed. And I don't think the record supports that. I think that some of what happened in 1967 is really key to understanding that. And I think he's very consistent in wanting to have control and in imposing loyalty tests, and that begins in 1967. And I want to just tell one little example from the 1967 minutes that I think in some ways is more telling than anybody who actually got thrown out. There was a woman who was one of the real stalwarts on the picket line. She was kind of one of the strongest Huelguistas, and she used as her personal physician a doctor named David Brooks, who had been helping the Union. And Brooks was one of the people who was thrown out because he was too independent. And the common denominator between the people who were purged at this point in time is that they all were too independent. They had their own vision of what they thought the Union should be, and they were not afraid or reluctant to speak out about that, whether it was as a doctor or as an artist or a performer, as in the case of Luis Valdez. And so Dr. Brooks was one of the people who was told to leave, but this woman was told that she had to make a decision between abandoning him as her personal physician or leaving the Union. In other words, if she were going to stay in the Union, she had to stop using him as her doctor. And that was a typical kind of little insight, I think, into the ways in which loyalty tests were always imposed. So you had to really be, fully loyal, and if you weren't, you had to go. And that's just consistent.
Yeah. One of the things that comes across in your book is that in some ways, Cesar was hardest on the people that he depended on the most. That the people that were closest were the ones that had the hardest time in terms of staying in the movement, and then the toughest time after the movement. So I just wanted to point out there's one really useful moment. I mean, you could focus on Dolores Huerta, I won't, but I was going to focus on Gilbert Padilla, who's with us today. So just read on 431. Of the top leaders who had left the union in recent months, only Gilbert Padilla talked to 60 Minutes on camera. For more than 2 decades, Padilla had followed Chavez's lead. Padilla was on the first NFWA board. He and Chavez had shared rooms, cigarettes, and picket duty. In the last few years, Padilla had struggled to understand Chavez's behavior. Padilla had gone to all the other top leaders and said, "Cesar's gone nuts." No one wanted to hear that. In October 1980, at a credit union board meeting, Huerta attacked Padilla and told him he should resign. He knew how Chavez operated. Padilla called Chavez and resigned the next day. Chavez had always been a dictator, Padilla told 60 Minutes. Quote, "And we let him because we needed him." Chavez shrugged off Padilla's criticism. Quote, "If he left without justifying, he'd be called a quitter." So, and there were other examples of that where it seems, and I said this at the end of my book, I thought that the heroism and the sanitized vision of the movement and Cesar's life really does an injustice to the people who fought for the movement, who shaped the movement, like Gilbert Padilla. And these moments are hard to digest in your book. And so I want to go back to that question about it's almost a love-hate relationship that he had with some of the most loyal people, some of the most creative people. Yeah, Dolores as well, to some extent. I won't read that because it's actually so foul that I don't want to shock some people here. But if you could say something about that idea.
Well, you know, he said very clearly that he didn't have friends, that you couldn't, if you have friendships, then your decision making is shaped by, you know, is colored by your friendships. And I think we see how his decision making was colored by his friendships with his family, like his cousin Manuel, where he tolerated behavior that he would not have tolerated in other people necessarily. But family is family, and that was different. That was a different issue. And he trusted his family. He didn't really have friends, and so for him, you know, yes, it was very difficult for the people, I think, around him. But I also think it was very difficult ultimately the tragedy is for the farm workers, and for the farm workers who rose within the union and whose power, a lot of this and a lot of his behavior and his decision making to a degree goes back to the CSO, which Matt mentioned earlier, and to his 10 years experience within the community service organization, and the lessons that he took away from that. And one of the lessons he took away from that was that when you empower people, they don't necessarily use that power toward goals that you share. So in the CSO, the issue for him was that the people who he was helping to understand their own collective power, many of them wanted to be middle class. And he thought that that was a terrible thing. He had a lot of disdain for that, and he wanted to make sure, and a lot of the things that we've been talking about come back to his intense commitment to making sure that his movement does not go the way of the CSO, and that people who do not adopt middle class values. Okay, that's a hard position for a labor leader to maintain, and that's why for him ultimately, when it comes down to are we a movement or are we a union, he goes with the movement. He's very clear that if he has to sacrifice the union for the sake of the movement, he will do so, and he says that on the tapes. But for the people around him and the people who were working as organizers and who were leaders within the union, but also for the farm worker leadership, like Mario Bustamante, who's also here with us today, that was a very difficult, that was an incredibly difficult position, because they were the casualties. They were the people who believed when Cesar Chavez said the goal is to turn the union over to farm workers, that he meant that. And ultimately, he never meant to turn the leadership of the union over to anyone. So, I'm not sure I answered your question.
That's useful. One of the revelations that's been picked up by by the press, BBC most recently, is the issue of immigration and Chavez's position on immigration. I've been asked endlessly about this, so this is the time to share that. And the insights are unbelievable, really. So there was, of course, the illegal campaign that had its greatest effect, maybe arguably in Arizona. And then the wet line that was established outside of Yuma. And so, I mean, I could read it, but basically there's a lot of physical violence that's committed pretty much at the behest of Manuel, I believe. But in the book, you reveal that there's a conversation. You have a document or a tape in which it suggests that Cesar was directing money and they turned off the tape. This is one of those rare times where they turned off the tape. So is there this is the question I always get asked, okay? Is there a context in which you can put the illegal campaign and the wet line into that makes that understandable or comprehensible, or let me just simplify, okay?
Right. So the official line, and you will read this in stories, and you'll hear this today from people who are with the UFW or the Chavez Foundation, is Cesar Chavez wasn't against illegal immigrants. He wasn't against illegal immigration. He was against strike breakers. Okay, and to some degree, there's some validity to that. He certainly was against strike breakers. It's certainly the border. Just for people who were way too young to have ever understood any of this, the border was not like it is today. The border was not militarized. The border was relatively porous. People could cross back and forth. It was not difficult. So the argument that growers had access to an unlimited supply of labor and could bring in people to break strikes, that's true. However, when the UFW launched the illegals campaign and directed staff to go out and find workers who were undocumented in the fields and report them to the INS, those were not necessarily people who were breaking strikes. And when they manned the wet line and they stopped people by whatever means necessary from crossing the border, they didn't stop to ask them whether they were going to break a strike. And there was only one strike going on at that point in time in Yuma. And certainly enormous amounts of UFW resources in terms of money went into the wet line for sure, and into the illegals campaign to some degree. It was also not an uncontroversial position at the time. And even Dolores Huerta, as a matter of fact, objects at one point to the use of the terms wetbacks and illegals because she says some people find that offensive, that the people are not illegal, their action is illegal. So, I mean, it's sort of interesting to hear an echo back in 1974 of something that is very much being talked about today as well. I think there are a lot of levels on which one has to, it's a complicated issue, but Cesar Chavez's feelings about immigrants were very strong. And they were not only about illegal immigrants either. He talks a lot, and this goes back to his belief that he did not want workers to become middle class. And he talks about the need to educate workers, and he talks about this a lot, to educate workers to understand the importance of sacrificing for others. So you should be more comfortable, you shouldn't be in poverty, but then you should turn around and help other people and not forget where you came from. And he was very concerned that people who were immigrants, legal or not, did not would be even if that their goal was so much driven by making money that the challenge of educating them was going to be even greater. So he was very leery about the possibility of building a movement around immigrants. Now, there was a lot of evidence that this was not true. There were many very strong union supporters among immigrants, documented and undocumented. There were some union organizers who had a lot of success in winning elections with undocumented workers, and that made him very uncomfortable. So his feelings about immigrants, I think, are complicated and go to issues that have to do with money and sacrifice. And we could talk about Arizona here a little bit too, because one of the big differences between the Arizona Farm Workers Union and the California UFW was how they approached the issue of the undocumented, and the Arizona Farm Workers Union achieved quite a degree of success for a period of time in getting contracts for almost entirely undocumented workforces. So, that was a big split.
And there's a wonderful exhibit in the library right now that commemorates that. And so I invite you all to go see that. A lot of these questions, I feel like we're kind of focusing on the negative things, and yet I think in some ways, maybe I know too much, but the overall affect is that there was a lot of things that make us question the legacy. And so the immigration, the purges, all of those things. And so, but I thought it's very interesting at the very end of the book. I want to invite questions after this, but first of all, you end with an Arizona figure, Gus Gutierrez. And
let me just interject one thing about the negative thing, because a lot of the interviews and a lot of the reviews of my book are focusing on the negative things, so-called. And I think partly that's because those are the parts of the story that haven't been discussed. So, we have talked about the fast and about some of the other parts of the story that were really remarkable, and about a lot of the people and the leadership that came out of the movement and that became the legacy. But the other stuff tends to be the focus because it's new and people are not as familiar with it.
Yeah. And that was the case of my book. In fact, people wanted to talk about Synanon and the game, and that kind of overwhelmed a book that's subtitled The Triumph and Tragedy of Cesar Chavez and the Farm Worker Movement. There's a lot of focus on the tragedy part of it. But I think you end on a positive note, and you end in Arizona. And Gutierrez says, and one of the few times you actually use an oral history.
The only time, right?
Yeah. Gutierrez smiled, at peace with his memories. He embraced Cesar Chavez in all his complexity. Quote, "Cesar was my mentor," Gutierrez said. Palms up, he held his right hand above his head and lowered his left near the floor. On balance, he said, the good outweighed the bad. It was not even close. And so what I've heard you say in a lot of interviews is that you've strived for that balance. You've tried to remind us that there are heroic moments in this life, and there certainly are. Amazing. But I think of this in a little bit in the ways that a film that I saw in 2006 called The Pursuit of Happiness, which is with Will Smith. Will Smith he is nominated for Academy Award. It's a film directed by an Italian director. And the point of this film is to show, even though there's struggle in America, the American dream is still alive and it's a positive thing. And yet, the film gets so dark for so long that the overwhelming affect of the film is, wow, life in America is really tough. And that's how I come away reading this book. First of all, I could not put it down. I read it continuously until I put it down. It was pretty amazing. But at the end, I thought, wow, the overall affect here is that the life in the Union for people who were not Cesar Chavez, and maybe even for Cesar Chavez, was pretty hard.
I think that's true. I think there's no way around the fact that the end of the book is sad, and that much of his later years were sad. There's a certain lion in winter sense to the end of his life. But I just want to add one other thing, which you talked about in an interview or in a comment recently. We focused on the farm worker part of Cesar Chavez and not part of his legacy, because that's something that both of us have researched and written a lot, and there are a lot of people here who were part of that piece of the movement. But I think his importance as a historical figure, if all he had done was, if his sole place in history was as the leader of a failed labor union, then he probably wouldn't be worth a 500-page biography. But so much of what he did and taught people was inspiring, and his legacy is so much. There is no legacy in the fields today, and that's really sad, and it's a tragedy for farm workers. but there's another piece of his legacy, and his role as a heroic figure and as the most prominent Latino in American history, modern American history, and the way that he inspired people and inspires people to this day. And the people who go to the film and cry at the film, even though they know the rest of the story, I think speaks to his symbolic importance. And then there is also more tangible legacy of his, and that is a generation of people who were inspired and trained and learned from him and learned from being part of the farm worker movement, and some even for brief periods of time. And those people have gone on and taught other people. And I got an email this week from someone who said, and now I'm going to embarrass someone who's in the audience here today, but I got an email from someone who said that The Union of Their Dreams was the best book he ever read, and it was his favorite book because of Gretchen Lowy, who was one of the characters in it, and because she changed his life, because he met her at a point in time when he didn't know what he was doing, and she taught him to be an organizer, and that was the most important thing that happened to him. And I think that's a great example of the way in which Cesar Chavez's legacy keeps going on. It didn't stop, and it goes on today, and you see it in the Dreamers and in the immigration activist movement and so on. So I think those are all the reasons why he's important and why, on balance, the good outweighs the bad.
Thank you, Miriam. I think that's a good segue to take questions from our distinguished audience, really. And some of those that have been mentioned are more than welcome to chime in. And maybe I'll share the microphone. So are there questions at this point? There's a lot that we left out. It's 500 pages. So
we also can talk about how, if there are questions about how, like, listening to tapes and those kinds of things too, and how you put something like this together. We can talk about that.
Well, let me say one thing about the tapes. It's pretty interesting. We were team tagging because when I was at Brown University, there was a professor even before us, that was trying to write a biography, and he died, a massive heart attack suddenly, and he was moving the tapes from reel-to-reel recordings to little cassettes. It was just dumped in a box. And then I came in there, and unbeknownst to me, Miriam was going in, and I took a team of undergraduate students to try to digitize them, and this was still when digital was still a little disc. But Miriam made the big investment. She took them, had them remastered, and I don't know what you did, but you made them fully digital and very usable, and I really am indebted to you for that. I thought I was doing a good thing. You did a great thing. And that is one of the big contributions of this research project and our research.
But that will be there for scholars and then there is a full record of the executive board meetings from basically 1973 through 1981 or so, and numerous other conversations and conferences that we haven't even, I didn't get to all of them.
And I listened to probably 2 or 3 years of tapes. You listened to 1,500 hours or something like that. So pretty amazing. This is research that people just don't do, but Miriam Powell did it. It's pretty amazing. Questions? I saw hands. Yes.
Hi, this is actually a question either both of you can address, because I know that, especially with the film, there has been, I know that the challenges that the both of you faced in terms of writing about Cesar Chavez this is something that actually a lot of Filipino labor leaders had trouble with, especially, for example, Philip Veracruz, and how he had such a hard time publishing his book. And if I would like the both of you to address, to talk about the UFW, if you could elaborate on the UFW as this multi-ethnic organization, and then also some of the issues that happened between Cesar Chavez and his vice presidents.
Sure. There's been a lot. I think when we talk about the resurgence of research in the UFW years, that we should also mention that there has been increased interest in the Filipino role, and there's a film that's been a documentary that's finally been completed that you probably are familiar with, but for those who aren't, the Delano Manangs, and it's premiering or showing in film festivals now. And that was a real labor of love, and it focuses on Lariat Leon, who was an important part of the leadership early on, and clashed in the values that I was talking about before. I mean, they never matched. And there's a lot. Lariat Leon's papers are also at Wayne State, and he did oral history interviews during that period of time where he talks, and some of this I use in the book, about his frustration and his anger and feeling shut out. You know, we skipped over so much, and one of the things we skipped over was the 1970 contracts that are won through the boycott and that are the great victory in the end of the movie. They were a disaster in terms of the administration, and the Filipino workers particularly felt that they had become very much second-class citizens, and their way of getting jobs through the hiring halls changed and so on. And Cesar at one point later on says on a tape where he, in a very rare acknowledgement that their mistakes had been made, he says, you know, the Mexicans thought we were stupid and the Filipinos thought we were corrupt. So there was a tension there. And then the other sort of important issue in terms of Filipinos later on becomes Chavez's decision in 1977 to go to the Philippines as a guest of Ferdinand Marcos. There's a picture at Wayne State, which I found, because there's all sorts. I mean, going to Wayne State is like sort of a treasure hunt, and with all of the frustrations and the incredible excitement when you find the treasure, but there's you have to go through a lot of haystacks to find the needles, and the photos are the same way. They're just photos thrown into files, and no one knows what they are. So I spent a lot of time going through photos. But there are a whole bunch of photos from his trip to the Philippines, and I posted a picture of Cesar Chavez and Ferdinand Marcos shaking hands on my website, and that has now generated a whole lot of discussion among Filipino historians about that. And the whole Marcos and his defense of Marcos and his defense of his comments in favor of martial law and his refusal to acknowledge that there might be any issues there was also a sort of an important small turning point for the Union in 1977, I think, because it caused some of, especially the religious supporters, to question for the first time their sort of pure support. I mean, a lot of people had heard about a lot of things that they didn't necessarily approve of, but they sort of put all of that aside. And then the Philippines issue forced that into the public view to some degree.
I've written a little bit about this. There's a couple things I want to say. First of all, that there were people in the movement who were Mexican who understood the importance of the Filipinos, and Gilbert Padilla was one of them. He was the one that was the liaison who was down there in Filipino Hall, it was an amazing thing that this union was multicultural, multi-ethnic, and it stayed that way well into the 1970s, and it was because that relationship was cultivated and cared for. And it fell apart over time, but not for the efforts of Gilbert Padilla, not for the efforts of Dolores Huerta in the very beginning. She understood, and that was the link. I think there's another issue about Lariat Leon, where there's an unfortunate quote where he says that the demise of the Union is because Chavez is given over to an Anglo brain trust, and it was in the LA Times. And I think that kind of reduces him to a kind of anti-white, kind of racist character of himself, because in fact he was at the same time talking in defense of the young white students who came and wanted to work in the movement and felt alienated by the move to La Paz, talking about young Chicanos who didn't feel like they owned the movement anymore. So that was a quote I felt like it was taken out of context when you actually read the record. And I think the story of the Filipinos and the movement, I think I've been given way too much credit, but I think it's partly because the work is still in process. And what I encourage people to do is write that history, because it's such a rich history. And it requires us to embrace political ideology. because a lot of the people at Leon in particular was very, very far left.
And Philip Veracruz in particular too. I mean, Veracruz was very politically, very ideological and very interesting, and did succeed in publishing his books. And his papers are all his papers, and Larry Leon's papers, and what's his name, Peter Velasco, are all at Wayne State also. So I mean, I do think there actually is a lot that can be done, and yeah.
I want to invite more questions, comments.
Can you talk a little more about the difference of Chavez's use of the term fast versus hunger strike, and if there was a particular objective with the different ones, and especially thinking about the one in 1972?
Right, the 1972 was his fast in Arizona. We should talk about that. That's a great question. So he was very clear that a hunger strike is you're going on strike until something happens and it has a specific goal attached to it. So lately, for example, there have been hunger strikes in the prisons that were specifically aimed at ending certain conditions or changing some certain practices in the prisons. And he said that he was not fasting in protest of a specific condition. He had the fast had different names. There was I'm going to get them wrong, the fast for life, the fast for love, and the fast for nonviolence. The first one was the fast for nonviolence. The one in Phoenix was the fast for love. And then this last one in 1988 was the fast for life, and that was about pesticides. And in all of those, there was a lot of Catholic imagery and a lot of religious overtones to them, which again was part of, as Matt said, what was off-putting to some people. But his point was that he was fasting as an act of personal sacrifice. He believed, and he talked a lot about the idea that when you sacrifice, it makes other people want to help you and to do things. You bring people to you. And he did that not only in fasting, but in the marches and in sort of other acts of physical sacrifice and penance. The fast in Arizona came in response to the state legislature adopting and the governor signing a law that would in effect have sort of banned the ability of the union to organize farm workers. And so he staged each fast got longer. The first one was 25 days, and the one in Arizona was 30-something days?
Yeah, it was May 11th to June 4th.
Okay. And
how long? 24 days.
And in both of those, and I think that we could also talk just quickly about the fact that those two fasts, unlike his last fast, were organizing tools. I mean, each of those, during the first fast, workers were organized around a courthouse appearance that Chavez had to make. And this is sort of when I wrote about the film, one of my criticisms was that the courthouse scene was completely cut out of the film. So one of the things that happened in the 1968 fast was that Marshall Gams organized the worker committees where the union had contracts. And when Chavez was doing court to respond to charges that involved violence and violent activities on the part of the union, the farm workers 4 deep ringed the courthouse, and they were in every hall and they were in every chair. And suddenly this courthouse, which had been very much the purview of the growers, I mean, the agribusiness controlled the courts in Kern County, and suddenly it was the farm workers' courthouse, and there was this tremendous sense of power. So the fast became a really important organizing tool in 1968, and then in Arizona, it led to the recall petitions. And so the fast became a way to use all the people who were drawn to the Santa Rita Center and who came to the nightly masses and send them out during the day to get signatures on a petition to recall the governor. And again, that was a way of enlisting people, and it was a way of using his own personal physical sacrifice to inspire other people to join the union and to help in the cause. In 1988, by comparison, when things were really, the union was, in its sort of very waning days, and he staged his longest fast about pet, and it was just amorphous from the beginning. It was about trying to get growers to stop using certain pesticides And really, there was not much response at all. There were some celebrities who came, but there was not a comparable use of the fast as a device to organize because the union really wasn't doing any organizing anymore.
So, other questions, other comments? We have veterans here. No? Yes.
What about
Please
the-
introduce.
I can speak louder.
Yes.
What about the period of the Agricultural Labor Relations Act?
Okay.
That's a really,
ALRA.
right,
Yes.
which we haven't talked about at all. So in 1975, because of all of the things that the UFW had been doing, and the organizing, and the boycotts, and the civil disobedience, and all kinds of other things that were going on, and because Jerry Brown, who's once again our governor in California, had just been elected as a very young governor in California, California passed the Agricultural Labor Relations Act. It was and is to this day the only act and the only law in the country that gives farm workers a lot of basic rights to organize. It establishes rules for elections and so on because farm workers are exempt from the National Labor Relations Act, which sets up those procedures for other workers. So the ALRA, I mean, I write about it a lot as a major turning point. I think it was a huge dividing line. Chavez did not ever really want a law. He was forced into the law to some degree because it was a compromise in order to get money from the labor movement, and because there was this pressure, and he saw that he had no choice but to support it. And once the law passed, it changed the nature of the union dramatically, because then there were elections. Once the union won an election, there were contracts to negotiate. Then those contracts had to be administered, and so there's a big split at that point. It's too bad that Scott Washburn is not here. He was certainly on one side of this split, which was one of the organizers who went out, thought this was the greatest thing in the world that had ever happened, because you could go out, you could have elections, and you could win the elections, and you could negotiate contracts, and it led to worker representatives like Mario and others, and so it was a tremendous organizing tool. But it took attention, it exacerbated that movement union conflict because it created this huge bureaucracy, and it created a lot of work that Chavez was not interested in. He showed, and this goes back to the 1970 contracts, he had not really any interest in contract administration or in doing the kind of things that bread and butter things that labor unions do. So it forced him into another direction to some degree. I mean, in order to preserve what he saw as the movement, he sort of undercut a lot of what was going on. The legal department, which had been a really effective part of the UFW up until that point, he loved the lawyers when they were fighting battles and when they were out there, doing outrageous things. But when they were labor lawyers and they were negotiating unfair labor practices and doing all the things that have to be done in order to negotiate and administer contracts, that wasn't as important. So I think it put into, he had to play by someone else's rules. He didn't like that. He liked to think of himself as the nonviolent Viet Cong. So it fundamentally changed things, and I think accelerated the decline of the union as a labor organization.
Questions? Yes. Yeah.
Oh. Well, perhaps in some of, so I'm taking from when you were talking about the, well, let's take the Bracero program. Okay, so it's been kind of documented in the Chicano series of probably 10 or 15 years ago that this was the point where he said,
Yes.
This is the time that we can go. Is that nuanced here in any way? Because
Yeah, and then thank you, because that ties back to I didn't go back that far back in terms of his issues about immigrants and so on, because I think that's really relevant. So his first experience organizing farm workers was in 1958 in Oxnard, California, and when he was part of the CSO. And the issue that the workers in Oxnard have is that the braceros are being brought in and taking their jobs, and that growers are taking advantage of this source of labor that is cheaper and is much more easily controllable, and they're firing local workers in order to, in circumventing it. So I think the roots of that and the sort of anger about the braceros taking the jobs, and that split between foreign workers, you know, who were those were legal guest workers, but I think that his feelings about that are sort of important in shaping the later sense of about immigrants in general. I think that there's a lot that's been romanticized about the story of Oxnard and the Bracero movement. I mean, the Cesar's organizing there, but without question, I think that is the point in time at which he sees that you can do something, that you can organize farm workers, and that is a kind of organ. It's the first time he does that. It's the first time he sort of, I think, sees the potential for forming a union, and he talks about that later. And Fred Ross, who was his mentor at that point, also says that experience in Oxnard was key to him deciding a couple of years later that he could go off on his own and do these things.
This has been an incredibly enjoyable experience for me as a writer, as a historian, and we're talking historian to historian. But I'm curious whether what we've done for an hour here now resonates with the people that actually lived the history. Have we captured it, or is there something that we're missing, or do we have it wrong? Have we put the exclamation points and the emphases on the wrong places? What is your opinion at this point? Anybody would like to speak about that? Yeah. So Gilbert Padilla, co-founder of the United Farm Workers, was there at the CSO. He's here today. Gil taught me a lot of things, spent a lot of time in Fresno with you in your home. So we're honored to have you here. But I wanted you to tell us whether we're on the right track, whether we emphasize the right things, or have we missed something? Have we approached this all wrong?
Well, this is a very complicated question and a very complicated issue because it's 45 years of struggle and ups and downs. And people don't understand, but I would like to answer her, young lady's question about the Filipinos, and I've always been upset about that part because Larry Leon was the one that started the strike. I had a little strike, but Larry Leon pulled the Filipinos out, and we joined them 10, 15 days later. But there was a problem because we were never together before that. Filipinos had their camp, we had our camp, Puerto Rican had their camp, and we didn't even know each other. We didn't know each other until September of '65 when I went to the Filipino Hall and first found out that different language, the Filipinos. And because when I was there and they were talking, the Filipino Hall was full of people, there was thousands of them. And I went and sat in the front, and there was 3 people talking, changing phones. And I asked, why are they doing that? What's wrong? He said, well, they don't speak the same language. And I said, what dialect? No, not dialect. Languages. Tagalog is the center. For the first time in the history of myself, I had never known them. But they had differences, right? Yeah, the trip to the Philippines was my first thought of leaving because, why are you going to the Philippines? I said, first I was excited, the Philippines. I asked him, you suppose we'll meet Luis Taruk, which was a Filipino guerrilla fighter? And he said, yeah. And then I started talking to people, you're going to go to Marcos? So I changed my mind, but I was already ready to go. That was a big blow. But he knew how to do those things. He was very cagey in those things, During the convention, when he came back from the Philippines, trying to convince us that martial law was good for the Filipinos. That Marcos was right. Philip didn't play much, but Pete Velasco did. And I got angry and says, how can you tell me that being under martial law is, Filipinos are happy? And it was crazy. It was crazy. And he cleaned it up because in the convention, he brought Ople, I forget his first name. He was part of the Secretary of Labor from the Philippines to speak at the convention. There was a big hassle. So, those are things that are not understood because it's hard for even a writer, a reporter, to write this history because it's like every 6 months we had a change or something, moving. But I want to respond to that because that was but I appreciate your question. Bring it out. And I got to tell you, the Filipino were very loyal. We learned to eat adobo, to eat fish heads and stuff like that. We became compadres on and on.
So we're here with Gretchen Laue and Mario Bustamante. I had the privilege of sitting with your brother in San Francisco, and you were important to maybe the pinnacle of the moment in terms of the ability to create a democratic movement, and it was all taken away so tragically. Cleofas Guzman's accident really, I think, undermined what had been built in Salinas and in Imperial Valley. What is your sense of the history now that's being told by Miriam? And does it capture both the triumph and the tragedy that you feel?
Mario's going to speak with you in Spanish, and then for 34 years, I'll try to translate for those of you that don't speak Spanish, but he speaks a lot and quickly, so now this time.
Bueno, primeramente yo le quiero agradecer a Mariel porque mucho tiempo esperamos varios trabajadores que alguien saliera a decir la verdad de lo que pasaba dentro de la Unión, porque mucha gente que conocimos a César, y aunque saben cómo era César, todos tienen miedo a hablar de la verdad.
He says first he'd like to thank Miriam for writing the book and telling the history, because for many, many years, farm workers wanted the story told. And many people who were very close to Cesar, and I think both Matt and Miriam talked a little about this, and Gilbert and the complicatedness of it, were afraid to tell the story, or didn't tell the story because it is complicated, and they were afraid.
A mí y a unos compañeros se nos ocurrió que el sindicato era de campesinos y debía de ser dirigido por campesinos. Y ya que vimos que en la mesa directiva casi no había campesinos, yo hablé con César y le notifiqué que queríamos poner campesinos a la mesa directiva. Pero eso fue ganarles su odio y ir en contra de todos los que habíamos iniciado esa idea.
So me and some of my friends, other workers with us, always believed or had the belief that the union was of farm workers and for farm workers, and that farm workers should be a part of the leadership of the union. And so I went to Cesar and talked with Cesar. We all went and said that that's what we believed, and we were going to put people, and it's in Miriam's book, and we were going to run people for the board of the union. And unfortunately, what happened is in that situation, we what we earned was not a place on the board, but we earned Cesar's anger and hatred, and things started to change.
Lo que pasó es que yo trabajé desde 1963 en los campos. Aquí empecé en Phoenix, Arizona, con una compañía que se llamaba la
Sun Harvest?
no era Sun Harvest todavía, pero era, bueno, ahorita a ver si me recuerdo su nombre. No era la Interharvest, o sea, todavía no empezaba esa compañía muy grande. Era la Salinas Valley. Y
¿En la variante?
Salinas Valley. Que después esa compañía se convirtió en la Sun Harvest, en la más grande de todas las compañías después de la Barendo,
Interharvest.
la Interharvest. Y nosotros le ayudamos a César, yo lo conocí a él en 1970, le ayudamos hasta 1982, hasta que él decidió que ya no iba a haber organización en los campos. Y desgraciadamente, desde 1982 no he visto a nadie más en ningún valle repartiendo volantes o tratando de organizar campesinos. Y mucha gente piensa que la Unión de Campesinos defiende o está haciendo algo por campesinos, pero en verdad no hay nada, no hay ninguna campaña, no hay nadie haciendo nada por campesinos, y esa es la verdad. Y entonces, yo por eso le respeto su trabajo a la señora Marian, que es la que escribe para mí la realidad y la verdad en su libro. Eso es todo.
So Mario says he started working here in Phoenix in 1963 with Sun Valley, which later became Inner Harvest, and then later became Sun Harvest, and worked with the union and with Cesar until 1982, when he parted ways with the union because of his belief about farm workers and organizing and the need to organize. And he just ended, I said a few more things, but he ended saying that since 1982, he hasn't seen anyone defending workers, fighting for workers in the fields, anywhere, handing out leaflets, and that it's been very painful for him not to see that and not to see what they worked so hard for so many years for, not there for farm workers today. And that's why he wants to thank Miriam, because he says that until Miriam really told the story, and that was the stories that Matt talked about in the LA Times, and then continued to do it, many people thought the problem had been solved, and that farm workers were taken care of, and that was being done. And that by writing the real and complex, the heroic and the sad story, people begin to be able to see what's out there and talk about what's out there, so he wants to thank that. And then Matt, if you have a little minute, I'll give my little piece of it. So, your question about the Filipinos and Gilbert's answer about being different corners, different parts of the world that never interacted with anybody. I think both Matt and Miriam talk about it, but obviamente puedes mirar que somos poco diferentes, Mario y yo. You can see that Mario and I are a little different, right? You know, when people see us, they sometimes wonder.
You have to point out that you're married.
Oh, we're married for 34 years, that's right. We've been together for 34 years, and we have 3 children, Rafael, Alejandro, and Ana Maria Carmen Cecilia Bustamante Lowry. So, we met in the union, and I think one of the great joys and tragedies of the union, we were just talking with a friend of ours, a reporter who came to the house the other night, was that there was an opportunity for us to be together, to learn from each other, to bring different strikes together. And I'm certainly a much different person because of the union. Creo que Mario también es un poco diferente por mí y por el experiencias de eso. And it was one of the great gifts of the union, and not just the fields, but which for Mario, and I would say, and I've said in other places, and this is just the last thing I will say about this, if I had been one of the boycotters in the union It changed my life. I became an organizer. I love organizing. Everything I do is around organizing. If Miriam's book had come out and I hadn't met Mario and I hadn't gone, we went last month and took a high school student at 2:30 in the morning to the border to see how people get up at 11 o'clock at night, US citizens who cross or with their green cards who come across the border to get a job, to start work at 5 in the morning, to go home at 3, to finish work at 3, to go home at 8 at night, to get up again at 11 o'clock to come across the border again. And we took a high school student who was doing a story to see that and talk to the workers and do all of that. If I didn't live that and see that, and Miriam's book came out, I would say, or Matt's book, I would say, keep priests de house. I wouldn't say it in Spanish because I wouldn't have spoken Spanish in the first place. But I would say, you know, how sad that such a wonderful thing and such a hero, the stories being told, and I would have forgotten about the workers, forgotten about the experiences and all of that because it was a part of me. So I think, I just guess I want to say that the opportunity for us to learn was such a great gift from the union, and the opportunity for us to learn now about both the complicatedness and what Mario says, and about the workers that are out there right now in very difficult situations. Situation worse, Mario would say today, than when he first started working after the Bracero program was over. So there's a real thanks to bringing it forward, and as Matt said, having the conversation about it.
My name is Vicente Viniera, and I grew up in San Luis. Born in Mexicali. My father came in as a Bracero, and we lived in the car for a number of years till we were able to live in the labor camp. Did the labor camps, went to San Luis High School, graduated, got recruited by some of his guys. Humberto Garza was the head of the EOP. And the message that was given to us at that time was, we want you guys to come in and stay in the communities, not go back, stay. Meaning, you know, we're educated, we're doing everything possible for your success in education. And that became our area where we learned more input values that have stuck with me for life. To the point that when I graduated, got involved with some of the CSO leadership, some of the people that ran MAXA, which is another famous group there in San Jose. From there, I got recruited to the Agriculture and Labor Relations Board. I was one of the first board agents that was actually from the fields, and I got to go back and investigate some of the farms where my dad, my mom, and I worked in the fields. There was one place out there by River Road, Mendoza Ranch. And I'm resigned it, I got built info in, and I went back there to investigate that unfair labor practice with some of the workers there. And this is like something out of the Twilight Zone. There were two kids that lived in the same house, and their names were resigned and Poet. That blew my mind. But the EOP experience, the experience of working with the UFW as a student supporter, working with the Agriculture and Labor Relations Board. I had opportunities to be some of the support system to back up Cesar. And behind me, we have Jose Cortez, an organizer here that also had a lot of opportunities. There's good, bad, and ugly in people. I worked with some of the strongest leaders of the Chicano movement, Reyes Lopez Tijerina, Jorge Gonzalez, bodyguarding Jorge Gonzalez, Reyes Lopez Tijerina, and also including Cesar from time to time. He had many. It was just like a little speck of the time frame there. The good, bad, and the ugly, that's what I wanted to address. I'm sitting here, I don't know who here has movement experience, who can even define movement. And so I'm sitting here kind of wondering, what is all this dialogue about without sitting a president here? Let's lay out the groundwork. Who here has some kind of commitment to some kind of movement? Student movement, any kind of movement. Because the dialogue that we're having here is at a very high level, very complicated. And we recently buried the founder of the Black Berets por la Justicia. You've heard of the Brown Berets, or the Black Berets por la Justicia. We recently buried the founder, and he was probably as complicated as Cesar and Porky. And neither one of them were saints. Any one of them were. I had an opportunity to write some things about Anselmo Candelaria. The very first thing I said was that he was a heroic figure. He did all these things. He inspired me. He turned me off. I loved him. The further away I was from him, I loved him more. But the bottom line is, he wasn't a saint. He wasn't perfect. He made a lot of mistakes, and so did all of us. There was nobody that that worked with any of these leaders that approached them in a perfect state, and none of us walked away in a perfect state. What we walked away with was that we were wizened. We began to realize that people are human, and we overlook a lot of times those things that are painful, and we overlook those things because there's a greater cause. There's a greater cause than the UFW. There's a greater cause than the Crusade for Justice out of Denver, Colorado. There's a greater cause of the student movement. When you put them all together, it becomes a major cause. But the organizing, like you said, it stimulated you to organize. I've never stopped organizing. Jose has never stopped organizing. He became La Voz de Aztlán here in Phoenix. And I mean, that continues to this day in many different ways. What Cesar did, in the good, bad, and ugly that Cesar had, just like all the other leaders, is that he inspired a lot of us in some ways that, when we were younger, we walked in as true believers. And then as you get older, you begin to see through the cracks of people. I'll give you an example. When Cesar died, we were part of the procession, the march that took his casket and placed it under the tent, and all these speakers came from everywhere. And Jackson, what is his first name? Jesse Jackson. I purposely forget, but I got very pissed off at him. Daniel de los Reyes, a black beret, a painter, famous Chicano painter, painted a beautiful picture of Cesar Chavez. And what he did was he approached Jesse Jackson, and of course the bodyguards didn't allow us to get too close, but I knew some of them, and I said, we just want to give this to Jesse Jackson to thank him for commemorating Cesar. And Jesse walks up and he takes it, doesn't even thank Daniel. He just takes it, sits down, and hey, you guys can go. And I looked at that, and all the heights that I had of Jesse Jackson just went right to the ground. I lost respect for him. That's the point I'm trying to make is nobody has perfect shining armor. Nobody does. In the Indian movement, I've had experience with Indian leaders, and when I got to know them on a personal level, I saw that they also had chinks in their armor. I grew up from experiencing that. I grew up and I realized no one around me is perfect, and neither am I. And do we have things to learn still? Yes, we do. To the day we die. And I'm just grateful. I'm grateful for Gilbert. I'm grateful for Humberto. I'm grateful for all of the people that I've come in contact with because they've helped me grow. Here's my 18-year-old son. I dragged him over here and I said, this is something you have to experience. But the question that I have, for all the rest of you that are not talking, is what is your movement experience? What is your definition of movement? How do you understand the movement? Because one of the things that I do understand about the movement is that we have a society here that I'm beginning to listen to all of the far right, far left, middle in between. And there seems to be a general consensus that this is a corporate America. It's no longer a constitutional America. It's become an America controlled by the corporations. And we've had that feeling for a long time working with students back in the 60s. But I guess the rest of America is starting to realize that or sense that. The movement, there's labor movements, there's student movements, there's civil rights movements, and there's human rights movements. They can all be connected or disconnected, but there's still a movement that is inevitable as long as we perceive that we are being manipulated and kept oppressed. So I struggle every day with just trying to keep a peace of mind, a sense of balance. And my wife tucks me at the collar and tells me, your movement is at home, buddy. You know, and the reason for that is because we adopted special needs boys. And she said, this is your Chicano movement here, okay? So now all of the experiences of my life, I have to focus it in a laboratory that's called my home. And it all has been beneficial to that extent. So my question to all of you is, what is your experience with movimiento? What is your definition? What is your sense of what we're talking about here?
Thank you. We're at 4:30. So,
Save by the bell.
but I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank Miriam for being here. Thank you, Miriam, and thank you for writing the book.
Thanks for doing that.